All right, welcome everyone. Today is Wednesday, the 4th of June, 2025, and this is the Cluster API Office Hours meeting. Cluster API is a subproject of Kubernetes SIGs, and as such, we follow their meeting guidelines, which can be summarized as please treat everyone as you would expect to be treated, or explicitly so, please be kind to each other. And if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I will call on you. At the beginning of our meetings, we like to welcome new attendees or new community members who'd like to say hello to everyone. So if that sounds like you, I will be quiet for a few seconds and please feel free to unmute yourself and say hi to everybody. All right, I am not seeing any hands going up or people unmuting. So we will move along to our open proposal readouts. I see Alessandro's here. Did you have anything you wanted to say about the updating auto scaling from zero enhancement?
Hello. I don't know. I've been responding to Fabrizio's review. I don't know if you guys prefer to discuss it during the meeting or by just continuing in the reviews.
I think
basically, yeah.
I was just gonna say I was looking at this comment that Fabrizio made the other day, and I think I owe a response here as well. So maybe I need to give a read through this again as well. Are we basically just I was just looking for like a status update, I guess, or if there's anything like do we just need reviews at this point to kind of take it further, or there are still some open questions? I guess there might be one question.
I think Fabrizio has some concerns yet. I want to better understand how to proceed on this with you, Fabrizio, Nico. I've responded to one of the comments. I have one concern about the other message by Fabrizio where Fabrizio mentioned you, Nico, because the only concern I have is
like this message?
Yes.
Okay.
In this message, essentially, Fabrizio is saying that we could avoid the capacity levels to process or to consider the architecture or the operating system labels, and that's okay. However, users might already be using these annotations today for setting those levels. So this, if we change the proposal that way, we end up in a situation where we have a breaking change somehow that we have to disclose or deal with.
Yeah, I'm just making a note here. I think I need to go back and read this again, and I can give you a better response then. What you're saying makes sense to me, but I think I want to think about it a little bit and then kind of form my thoughts there.
All right.
I don't know, Fabrizio, did you have any, or Stefan, I see you got your hand up, please.
Yeah, I also have to read it again when I find the time. I'm just wondering, this just sounded like that we already have it implemented? Or how? So it sounded like we cannot change the proposal because we already implemented it, and changing the proposal would mean changing the existing implementation, which would be a breaking change. But I assumed that it's not implemented yet.
I can't
or am I mixing up some stuff?
Alessandra, did we already put those in to the
so the capacity levels are already implemented. The capacity levels, for capacity levels, the capacity.cluster.scale.kubernetes.io, I think, /labels, that is already available in the contract. If you're scrolling there and if you look for labels.
Okay.
Did we already put a annotation there for them though? I don't.
For the labels, you do have one that can be used for the
label,
architecture as well.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that was in the past already. Sorry. I
Right.
thought for some of the stuff that is new in the proposal that is already implemented. Yeah, I would
Right.
try to not go back on stuff that we already decided on in the past. But I'm
Right.
not sure if that's what Fabrice is suggesting. I have to read the whole thing to make sure I get it
Yeah,
right.
these are the real thing is like adding these annotations that are like the override annotations. But I see Fabrizio has his hand up, so please, Fabrizio.
Yeah, I think that, so with regard to this point specific, I'm a little bit confused. So if I look at the proposal in Cluster API, we only have annotation. And we have annotation and status field. One cannot be an override for the other. And we are just adding a new set of annotation and a new set of status field. So we have to add them in the same way, define the contract. The contract should be lazy. We should not prescribe it in terms of the type name or whatever. It should only be about the field that we are serializing. Okay. Then we need, from a Cluster API point of view, we need to figure it out. Since we can set the same value both in annotation or in two different objects or in status in another object, we should figure it out a priority. What if the value is set in three places with different value?
Oh,
So
right,
this,
right. Yeah, so this
so
is defined in the original enhancement. The annotations always override the status field that's in the infrastructure.
okay, that's great. Maybe I missed it because I searched for it. I did not find it. But okay, so, and this where, let me say, I'm comfortable. We just have to shape out some detail. We can do this offline. Okay, when I'm less comfortable is when we start talking about labels, because there are no labels in Cluster API for this thing. I understand this is an implementation detail which happen in the autoscaler. I understand this. When you do your computation for the node placement, at certain point, whatever we have in status in annotation goes in label. I understood this. But I don't want this to surface or to be something that the Cluster API user must know when using this interface. Our interface is already status field and annotation. What happens in the autoscaler could be an information, but should not be something that everyone is using Cluster API should be concerned about. Because otherwise, it's really, I need to be an autoscaler expert to put an annotation in copy, which seems so this is where I'm struggling. And what looks like that is a point is that somehow it is possible to have one value which is capacity that means that overlaps, which is a clear, let me say, value or a distinct value setting copy to overlap architecture value, which is a different set of status field and annotation in copy. And so as a copy user, there is no way that this overlap can happen, because we have different annotation, different status field. But this is where I'm getting confused. And so I would like to clarify possibly on the proposal, because it's not easy as a topic to discuss without an example in front.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I'll try to come up with I'll reread this, today or tomorrow and then try to give a more well-formed response. What you're saying makes sense, and I totally get it. Like we see this with users all the time, having to understand how these annotations work and where they come from. In an ideal world, when we first designed this feature, the hope was that every provider would be able to supplement the infrastructure machine template objects so that the cluster autoscaler, the user wouldn't have to know anything, right? Like all the capacity information would come from the provider and it would be put into the infrastructure machine template, and then the cluster autoscaler could learn that information. But we knew that it was going to take time for the providers to opt into that contract. So the annotations were given as a way to signal on the scalable resource what the values would be in the infrastructure machine template if they existed, right? And I totally get what you're saying now. Like it's called capacity, but then it says architecture, and this is not reflected in the status field of the infrastructure machine template. So maybe we need to just come up with a better way to make this, easier to understand from the user. But I also know that I know there are Red Hat engineers who are starting to look at, how we can supplement some of the providers. And, again, kudos to the vSphere maintainers and the IBM maintainers and, the other folks who have put these fields into their providers, because that's really the ultimate answer. That alleviates all the user kind of interaction if this can be done at the provider level. Alessandro, please.
Yeah, reading the comment by Fabrizio, I also see that there is some misunderstanding or typo there, because we don't have a capacity. Sorry, the naming is very difficult. We don't have a capacity annotation for the architecture. We only have what I'm proposing is to add the node info dot cluster autoscaler. This node info annotation for the architecture and the operating system. What we already had is capacity / labels. And that's where probably the misunderstanding with Fabrizio is happening, because we will not have, the Fabrizio's concern is that we will have 3 ways to set up the architecture of the future node, right? And we actually have 2 for the architecture, and there is another one that can be used by the users for that purpose as well, because it's more generic, and that's the labels one. We don't have labels there. It's an annotation that will compute the future levels of the nodes, right? So the concept is reasonable, because we have to establish somehow how these 3 things will work together. But it's about having a more generic approach that is already in place, limited or not, and if not limited, how to establish which one will come first.
You muted, Mike. Mike, you muted. We can't hear you.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah. So, yeah, Stefan, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in here quickly. Yeah, the confusion here is that in this proposal, we're trying to bring architecture in as a formalized structure into the status. But in Kubernetes, because there's this well-known label for Arch, sometimes what users do is they want to key workloads looking for this Arch label that is expected to be on the node that gets created. And when we're scaling from 0 with Cluster API, due to our label propagation rules, it's difficult to mark the machine deployment in a way that the cluster autoscaler knows there will be a kubernetes.io/arch label on it. So what some users do is they use this labels field to let the cluster autoscaler know what the labels on the node will be when it arrives. And so they're putting the architecture label in this portion of the cluster autoscaler annotations. That would be like, yes, that would be like a third way to do this same, because what we're talking about here is allowing users to put this on to specify the architecture for what that machine will be. So I totally get where the confusion could come in here. I'm not sure how we make this less confusing. Stefan, did you still have a follow-up?
No, I think I got it.
Okay,
But yeah, I also don't know what we can do about it apart from clearly documenting what a priority order is. Like, I
right.
mean, as you were saying, like annotations general override whatever is in the status, and then it's probably only a question of documenting what the priority is between the specific annotations and the label annotation, right?
Right. Okay. That's good feedback. You know, Alessandro and I'll leave a comment here in reply to this. Apologies for taking a little bit to get back here. Okay, the next open proposal is the chained and efficient upgrades for cluster API with managed topologies. Do we have someone who wanted to talk to this?
Mm, I'm not aware of activity on the proposal. Please take a look. I have a PR that I can demo, even this does what is written, so it upgrade by multiple step. Yeah, I need the time to prepare some demo or something to show.
Okay, thanks. Alrighty, so we'll get into our regular discussion topics then. I added one here because this is a topic that's come up in the SIG cloud provider group, and I wanted to kind of start a discussion or maybe see where we're at here. But I'm curious about cluster API usage in the core Kubernetes testing. And so the context here is that in SIG Cloud Provider, we've been talking about improving the tests that we have there. But you know, SIG Cloud Provider is responsible for the cloud controller managers, and this has gotten us into the notion of thinking about Kubernetes distributions, right? So once you take the core Kubernetes and you add a cloud controller manager to it, you know, in essence, you're creating a distribution of Kubernetes, whether that's for, you know, OpenStack or AWS or vSphere or whatever it is, you're creating a customized version of Kubernetes. And so as we're thinking about how we bring up various, you know, distributions of Kubernetes to test the different cloud controller managers against, one of the things we've been talking about is what projects can we leverage for creating clusters. And so, you know, naturally we talked about we've talked about COPS. I think we've talked about KubeSpray. We've talked about other things. We've talked about Cluster API. And so I just wanted to start the discussion here and see if, you know, maybe some of the maintainers or anyone else in the community had been, you know, engaged in any discussions about this, or if we've given any thought to, like, you know, one day would we see the core testing using Cluster API to create clusters, you know, to run end-to-end tests on or anything. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious if anyone has thoughts about this or has thought about it. Yeah, Fabrizio, please.
I can give a little bit context. So we tried a couple of times to have something to be considered in the test, in the Kubernetes test. So the key point is we can have test and we can ask them to be release informing or release blocking. Okay, what is the prerequisite to get a test, release informing or release blocking? Is that those tests should be curated. So if there is a failure, someone has to quickly step up and fix to unblock the release. And unfortunately, we had in the past release informing test for a couple of providers, but the team of those providers were struggling, and so they were removed from the informing grid. So it's not an issue. You just have to have a test, go there to go to have a test in test grid, then go to SIG release, ask if they would like to consider your test for release informing first and then for blocking, and they will start asking you, okay, how this test is stable, how much you will fix issues, etc. Because at the end, if a test is there and the release team has to always ping a maintainer whenever there is an issue, and always ping them to fix the issue, and wait. It goes without saying that they are going to remove it. So the test must be curated, etc. And that's the big issue. So historically we tried, but this was never properly staffed, basically. I don't think that is a big issue. I can take every kappa V test, kappa test, KW test, and put and go there and ask to add them in the release. If I can prove that the test is stable over time, I think that no one will object. They will make their due diligence. I don't know if criteria stepped are changed over time, but I don't think that is the issue. The real issue is to have someone that takes care of those tests over time, every release, continuously, like we do with our CI signal. Every week we take a look at it, and you should do the same if you propose your test for SIG informing or blocking.
Right. I appreciate that. That's good advice. I guess like part of my question too is like, what about using cluster API in the test infrastructure to create clusters to run tests on? Have we ever kind of explored that possibility? Like not specifically testing cluster API, like not putting cluster API tests as release blocking, but what if we could use cluster API as part of the testing infrastructure to manage creating test clusters in an easier way, I guess. That's kind of where I'm going with this.
I think not completely directly related to the Kate's testing, but to Cloud Provider vSphere. In Cloud Provider vSphere, we use Cluster API vSphere to create a cluster and then to run the Cloud Provider tests in that cluster. That's what is done there. Not completely related to the upstream Kate's testing signals, but for the Cloud Provider signal and releases.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of like exactly where I'm going with this. Like what if we had the Kubernetes testing infrastructure and the ability to like run cluster API there and use cluster API to create like AWS clusters or vSphere clusters or GCP clusters, whatever kind of arrangements the various cloud providers have made to donate hardware. Like I'm wondering, could we use cluster API at that layer, or have we done anything like that yet? Matt, please.
Yeah, we are also for the cloud provider for Azure, obviously using CAPI and CAPZ to provision clusters. And there's a whole bunch of other satellite projects that aren't core projects, but that are Azure SIG cluster lifecycle related that all depend on CAPZ at this point. And we've talked about it before because, and essentially, I think the consensus is at this point that CAPI and CAPZ is the standard tool for all those projects. And so we want to make sure that it lives on. We've talked about like maybe we could build it into Kube Test 2 before, which is the standard sort of create me a cluster, fire and forget tool that is used in some places, but it just seemed like it would be too difficult to wrap all of CAPI into something like that. But yeah, I guess we've kind of gone back and forth, like, is there a better tool? Is there something simpler we could use? Because we really don't need the lifecycle management for most of this stuff. We just want to fire and forget a cluster. But at this point in the Azure world, we've sort of settled on CAPI as the standard thing to set up a cluster. So it'd be great if it got used more broadly, because that's where we're at.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. Like, and that's exactly the kind of direction that I'd love to go with like the cloud provider stuff. Stefan, please.
Yeah, just an additional hint. So basically what we're doing, just adding to what Christian was saying with CAPI. So basically we run like the same end-to-end tests in CAPI and CPI and in the cloud provider vSphere. We just run basically quick start and some simple stuff. We don't run more advanced plus API things. But depending on how you integrate that, just a hint, you have to be aware of. So if basically you have like an end-to-end test module or something in your cloud provider, like as Go code, and there you're importing test framework of cluster API, you have to be really careful about dependencies like controller runtime. Because usually in cloud providers, you're trying to use very latest Kubernetes. So if you want to release the cloud provider 133, you want to use K8s.io 133 because you need to use cloud provider 133. That is usually not compatible with what you get from cluster API because cluster API is basically 4 months behind on that because we are one controller runtime version back and also controller runtime is released after the Kubernetes release. So if you end up basically having a Go module where you have where either direct your cloud provider is part of the Go module or has a dependency to your cloud provider, but also has a dependency to the cluster API test framework, then you might run into problems that it doesn't compile anymore at certain points in time, or you have to pick up commits from main from somewhere. The way we avoided this in CPI vSphere is that we basically stopped using controller runtime. Which sort of is probably fine for a cloud provider because the cloud provider is, I mean, they use their own cloud provider library, right? It's like a whole controller already and you just plug in as far as I know. So I don't know if people usually use like the full controller runtime thing there in the sense of like the manager and all of that stuff, or if they usually just use the client here and there a little bit. But yeah, just like heads up, if you integrate this on a Go level, be careful about those sort of dependencies or think how it works over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I hadn't thought about that. Kind of, yeah, you do want the kind of recent releases of the cluster API providers and everything. But yeah, the notion here is that in SIG Cloud Provider, we're talking about how we can create kind of like a generic set of tests that every cloud provider could like, implement parts of. And we're thinking about the infrastructure around, okay, if we wanted to have a centralized set of testing where we say, okay, we're going to run these cloud provider tests because the CNCF owns a lot of these cloud provider codes because they're in the Kubernetes SIGs org. So it's like if we could test those, it would be great, but we'll need to automate the creation of like clusters on different platforms. And it would be great if we could reuse projects that are already making this easy, like COPS and cluster API and whatnot. So that's kind of what the exploration that I'm getting into here. Fabrizio, please.
Yeah, just to bring up also some past discussions. So currently when we use cluster API in end-to-end test, we go down the hard way. So we basically create inside the test, we create first a management cluster, and then we create the workload cluster where we run tests. And this is sort of complex. If you think about this, it will be way better if there is a managed management cluster that you can use and just, give me a cluster. But the point is, who is going to manage this centralized management cluster? And currently, folks in test infra, they have PRAO, and that's what they manage. If we want to set up this, we have to figure it out, how to make this happen, basically. But it will simplify, this will simplify also in terms of test duration. It will cut down a lot. It will simplify a lot because you don't have the dependency that Stefan is talking about, because just you ask to, somehow you ask to test infra, to PRAO, give me a or whatever solution we will find, give me a cluster with this machine nodes on this infrastructure provider, and then you will get a kubeconfig or something like that. But this has to be designed. So if you want to make this simple and usable, that's the target solution. We have to think about a managed CAPI cluster. If otherwise, what we are doing today is not the simplest path, is the complex one. Create a bootstrap cluster and then create a workload cluster. So test. One level on in directness that is complexity. If you look at this from folks outside the CAPI team.
Yeah, no, thank you, Fabrizio. And I think this, like the kind of things that you're talking about are exactly the ideas that I want to push into here. Because, yeah, like I would love it if there was a future where in the Kubernetes end-to-end tests, it did look more like what you're talking about, where like a specific test could say, I'm requesting a cluster, you know, this is the infrastructure, or this is the topology I'm looking for, this is the provider I'm looking for, and then some cluster API, you know, kind of managed setup could then create those clusters for the user. But like you said, this cuts across a lot of different areas, and it is complicated. So I'm really feeling out a lot of the options right now to see like what might we be able to get away with, or what might we be able to design. And is cluster API a good choice for us, or do we want to stick with something more like COPS or whatever? A lot of this is inspired by, if you look at the way we do multi-platform or multi-infrastructure testing in the core Kubernetes now, it's been very bespoke for many years, going back almost to the origins of Kubernetes. There are script files for like kubeup and stuff like that have been used, and there are specific scripts for the different platforms that we test on, like AWS and GCP, and those are maintained in the core Kubernetes repository. And so it would be nice if now in retrospect, we've gone through all these years, we've iterated on Kubernetes, what if we could use a project like Cluster API to bring back into our infrastructure management to make our testing easier, so that we could start to test on more cloud platforms in a simpler manner. And I think some of the points people are bringing up here are great. And I'm gonna, I'll just add this into all the research I'm doing. Really appreciate the discussion. Did anyone else have any questions or comments about this topic? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands going up or people unmuting, so let's move on. We've got no provider updates today, and it looks like Thilo has a feature group update for us. So please, Thilo.
Yeah, we're currently looking for reinforcements in the node provisioning working group. We've reached a pretty solid kind of level where people can join in and can pick stuff up. Our first deliverables we focused on is making development easier. That was initially challenging because for development and testing, we use Flatcar, which uses Ignition, which cannot be used or could not be used in the regular Cluster API development workflow, as this was based on, I think, Kind. And so Ignition is rendered at boot time very early in the init.rd, and Kind works with Docker, so there is no init.rd. So you couldn't basically cut to the beef of it and actually use the Ignition config. We improved that. You can now have a development workflow based on KubeVirt, and that's in. We have initial steps at bootstrap provider separation, in that we've been dabbling with a kubeadm Ignition bootstrap provider. We're a little spread thin right now, but we are fortunately at a point where we consolidated and where it's easier to join the project and to actually go ahead with development. Now, in the last office hours that we had, in the last office hours call, a SUSE developer joined. Let me check. That was Alex Demichev. I'm not sure if he wants to become a regular, but a few folks are interested or know people who want to join the initiative. I think the SUSE interest is natural, right? Because SUSE MicroOS also uses Ignition and would benefit from Ignition version 3. I think Red Hat, CoreOS, and Fedora CoreOS also use Ignition version 3 only. So getting that change in and then upgrading to Ignition version 3 would basically automatically make them compatible with Cluster API. You could just use them seamlessly instead of Flatcar. Not sure if you can ping a few folks, Mike. I think that would be very interesting in terms of collaboration. yeah, that's basically my part. I just saw in the chat that Matt will be joining. That's awesome. So I was thinking, I was considering to cancel tomorrow's meeting, but if folks want to join, yeah, absolutely. I'll make a call out in the Slack chat tomorrow as well, so people know this is going on. That's basically our status. We're currently looking for more hands.
Cool. Thank you for the update. And yeah, so I guess if anyone is interested, reach out to Tilo in the Slack channel or just, ask about the Node bootstrapping working group and Tilo will see it. Is that about it?
Yeah, that is.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much. Looks like we are at the end of our agenda. So I'll give a last chance for anyone to ask a question if they have one. Going once, going twice. All right. Thanks everyone for coming out. We'll see you next week and have a good week and weekend and everything.
Thanks, Mike.